It's no secret that the vaccination program was in much worse shape than my team and I anticipated. We were under the impression and been told that we had a lot more resources than we did when we came into office.
That was President Biden in early February, not quite complaining, but certainly commenting on the vaccine system he inherited from the Trump administration. It's been about 5 weeks since he made those comments, and the system has clearly changed for the better. As of this morning, the U.S. had administered 113 million vaccine doses. All those shots mean more than 22% of the nation has received at least one dose of vaccine, and 12% of Americans are now fully vaccinated, as we average more than 2.5 million vaccine shots every single day. We've seen gradual increases in daily vaccinations since we first hit 1 million shots in a single day back on January 11th. And in the past week, we saw one day where more than 4 million Americans received shots. The pace of vaccinations has picked up so much so fast that President Biden was able to make this announcement today, weeks ahead of time.
And I'm proud to announce that tomorrow, 58 days into our administration, we will have met my goal of administering 100 million shots to our fellow Americans. That's weeks ahead of schedule.
But did the change in leadership at the White House contribute to the change in our vaccination pace, or is that just some political posturing from the Biden team? A new piece on the site Talking Points Memo is asking that question, as it notes the change in target dates for widespread vaccine eligibility from the fall to now this May. For more, we turn to the author of that piece. Josh Kovensky is an investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo. Josh, your piece tracks how vaccine production, capacity, and access exploded, especially compared to early estimates in the timeline. So let's start by going back to 2020, from the Trump administration to local officials. What were the issues that prevented the U.S. from really ramping up vaccine production?
I think the biggest thing you have to consider is money. At the end of the day, throughout 2020, local officials, state officials, organizations representing them in Washington were lobbying for the Trump administration and for Congress to give them the billions of dollars needed to set up and implement a full-fledged vaccination campaign that would allow the COVID vaccine to be delivered immediately, starting in December, starting with approval of the vaccine. That did not happen. Congress didn't pass the money until December, and the Trump administration officials, we later found out, actively lobbied against that from happening. So that kind of set the whole thing up, if not for failure, at least for a very slow start.
So the COVID bills, and there were a number of them that passed through Congress in 2020, had no impact on the vaccine distribution process until we got to that December bill?
Yes. So the CARES Act passed in, March of 2020, had money for vaccine development and manufacturing, but few people know this, but had no money for vaccine distribution. It was an oversight. Congress thought at the time that they could address it later, but it ended up being politicized. Again, the Trump administration lobbied against it. So in spite of the pleas of many state officials and epidemiologists, their money was not passed until December.
It sounds like from your reporting that Trump or the Trump administration or both was focused much more on vaccine production and much less on vaccine distribution and getting shots into arms. A fair way to describe it?
Yeah, I think that's definitely accurate. And I mean, it's important to keep in mind that the career officials who are responsible for Operation Warp Speed, the Trump administration's effort to accelerate vaccine distribution, I mean, they did their job. The way that worked was they financed the development of all these vaccines without knowing if they would work or not. And they also financed the company's ability to scale up manufacturing of those vaccines, again, without knowing what the results would be. So, I mean, that was a massive success, but it just wasn't really thought through why or what would happen after the vaccines were manufactured. What ended up being the Trump administration's plan, and I use that word very loosely, was to just sort of dump the vaccines with the states. And it's still not clear if that was due to ideology or what that led them to believe that, they could kind of do half of it without doing the other half.
You also write the reporting on the physical transportation of the vaccine, getting it from companies to the states, and also letting states know how much vaccine they were going to be getting in what sort of time frame, all changed as we went from Trump to Biden. Was that specific Biden policy changes?
Yeah, so let me rewind a bit because that was a huge problem that I think started appearing in December when the vaccine distribution first occurred. The Trump administration made these really big promises about how much vaccine they could deliver to the states and to the American people. And what they kind of ended up landing on was a number of around 20 million shots per month in December. So mid-December, it's the first week of vaccine distribution, and all of a sudden, all these states around the country get calls from Washington saying, "Look, we're actually going to be able to meet. We're only going to be able to deliver 16 million shots nationally," and some states had their allocations cut by up to 50%. It's still kind of unclear how or why that came to be, but what ended up happening was it made it really difficult for the states to plan how much vaccine they were going to distribute because they kept getting these calls the day before the shipment arrived telling them, actually, we were wrong, your numbers have changed. So what the Biden administration has done, and this is a really complicated process, so it's very hard even for people who are working on this to, I think, provide estimates far in advance that are totally accurate. What the Biden administration has done is they've provided minimum allocations for the states 3 weeks in advance. So if you're a planner at some state public health department and you're trying to figure out, for Nebraska or Ohio or wherever you are, how much vaccine you have, and you're going to distribute to the hospitals and clinics in your state, at least the bare minimum that you will have, and you can kind of build up from there as you get closer to the date of final distribution. So that's one thing that's a huge impact. It's really greased the wheels, I think, of distribution, and it's made it easier for people who are actually managing the process to be able to forecast how many doses they have, and therefore how many doses need to go to certain places.
Did the administration, I assume it's the Trump administration, just not know how many doses would be available to send to states, or were they not keeping track of it? What exactly changed when we went from Trump to Biden in that regard?
I mean, it's still kind of a mystery. If you look back at what happened in December, it's interesting because when that first when those first calls came forward to the states saying that in some cases 50% of their allocation would be cut, there was a lot of confusion over why. And Pfizer put out this statement saying, like, look, we have millions of doses sitting in our warehouses. We're waiting for orders on where to send them, and we haven't gotten them yet. What's going on? And again, I mean, a couple days after that, a general in charge of distribution for Operation Warp Speed said, this was kind of due to regulatory issues with the FDA in terms of how long it takes to do a final check of the doses. But that wasn't really borne out, I think, by subsequent reporting as being the result of the delay. So it remains unclear if it was just an organizational issue, what it was. What I can say is that even for the Biden administration, which I think experts kind of agree is doing a better job and has a better kind of track on what doses are going where, they're having a problem right now where the federal government is sending doses to federal facilities in the states, and the states are receiving doses from the federal government, but the states don't always know what doses the federal government is distributing directly, either via FEMA or federally qualified health centers at the state level. So you still, even now, even though things are much faster and they're much better organized, you're ending up with a situation where the left hand doesn't necessarily know what the right hand is always doing.
Finally, Josh, there were some confusing vaccine headlines around the time of the Biden inauguration, and I'm wondering if any of your reporting on the story led to any clarity on them. There were claims that that the vaccine system was in worse shape than he thought when he took office, that the Trump administration never ordered enough vaccine to cover every adult American, and that some 20 million doses that were sent to states in the waning days of the Trump administration went somehow unaccounted for. Did your reporting uncover any new information on any of those?
So on 20 million doses, yeah. I mean, one issue there was a lot of miscommunication in the final weeks, really, of the Trump administration around whether or not the second dose for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines was going to be held in reserve by the Trump administration and then sent subsequently, or whether or not people could just use the doses themselves. And there was a lot of miscommunication. It was never clear. And so what happened was, and this only accounts for part of that 20 million, is a lot of doctors thought that they needed to keep the second dose in reserve on their own, which ended up leading to hundreds of thousands, if not more, doses just kind of sitting in freezers around the country because the guidance was so unclear. Part of it just has to do with the speed and the lack of planning. I mentioned at the beginning that there was no money to kind of plan for distribution, so that led to some doses being lost. On the manufacturing issues and the issue of supply, yeah, it's true that the Trump administration didn't secure enough doses, but to vaccinate the whole country. But that really only came true once the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was approved last month by the FDA, or authorized by the FDA last month. So it's true that at least for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, they didn't do their job. I mean, they had options to extend those contracts, which they did not take. It's not really clear why they didn't do it, and they only really started doing that once there was huge public pressure to do so in December. But I think it remains to be seen why they were so kind of lackadaisical about filling out the second half of the vaccination campaign.
Josh Kovensky is an investigative reporter for Talking Points Memo. Josh, it's a terrific piece. Thank you for that and for the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And up next, on the same day the FBI releases new video of the Capitol rioters savagely beating police who were trying to protect the Capitol on January 6th, we learn that a dozen Republicans voted against a resolution to honor the very same people who risked their lives to save lawmakers that day. After the break, we'll show you who they are and call them out.